So I'm used to standing on stages like this representing Corning, but as Andre introduced, I'm also board member for the Fibre to the Home Council Europe, and I'm going to present the Fibre to the Home Council Europe's status here at the Africa show. So the three things I'm going to cover is the state of the fibre market, so we call that the FTTH/B market panorama, a report on the socio-economic benefits of fibre, and then finally looking at the policy and regulation aspect in Europe and how that is driving the rollout. So firstly, the state of fibre. So the market panorama is a report which the council have done for many years. iDate is the analysts who produced that report. I would just want to draw your attention to the letter B, which is sneaked into that title there. So it's FTTH/B, which means fibre to the home / fibre to the buildings. And so that means that, particularly for MDU deployments, if a building is fed by fibre, but not each apartment is necessarily linked by fibre, that still counts as fibre to the home. So those numbers are all rolled in, and you'll see the impact that has on the overall picture. So the first slide really is looking at how Europe fits into the world, and you can see that what we're showing here is the total number of subscribers in each part of the world, and you can see that Europe has 29.5 million fibre to the home connections, and the fibre to the building are rolled into this. Often the US is kind of put forward as a pioneer of fibre to the home, but in terms of number of subscribers, you can see that Europe actually has half as much again as the US. And then this B aspect really comes in when you look east and look at Russia and China, where the figures really dwarf the other areas, and that's really because those areas are very much dominated by MDUs, and particularly China, and so you only need one pair of fibres or one fibre feeding a building, and that really bumps up the numbers. So that's why you see that huge rise there. So there's no Africa in there because we've got the Africa report that's coming on later. Now this is an interesting slide. I've sat in your position and had this slide presented to me many times, and the first thing I've said is, what a bad slide, you can't see what's on it. So I apologise for that. I mean, it's the slide that came from the report. But let me try and make things clear for you. So this is the famous global ranking. So country by country, we're looking at who's rolled out FTTH, not in terms of absolute numbers, but in terms of percentage of homes. And what the measure across the top is 0 to 100%, and it represents the number of connections as a percentage of the total number of premises in the country. So if we have 50%, then half of all the premises in that country, regardless of whether they're passed or not, half of those premises are connected to fibre, and it's fibre to the home / fibre to the building. And another key aspect of this this graph is that the split of fibre to the home and fibre to the building is shown by the blue and orange blocks. So let me try and highlight a few aspects here. Firstly, I'm representing Europe, so where does Europe fit in that? So Europe is here in this position, and it's about sort of 19-20% of all homes in Europe are connected to fibre to the home. Where does that kind of correspond with the US? Well, it's about the same in terms of percentages. So 14.5% is the US. Now, like most league tables, like the any league table that you see, everybody looks to the top to see who's leading, and the lead is very much going into the Middle East and the Far East. So UAE are proud to have 94% of all their premises connected with fibre, and as you can see, that's blue, so they're all true fibre to the home. So even within the MDU buildings, there's fibre inside those buildings feeding each apartment. So that's a great record by UAE. But that's followed up by Qatar, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong and Japan. And you can see within that there's a big range of fibre to the home and fibre to the building. So Hong Kong, for example, has a large proportion of fibre to the building. Just a few other highlights. I mentioned before on the other slide that the number of homes connected is dominated by Russia, and the percentage, you can see where Russia come in, but it is mostly red or orange. And Mauritius, I think, certainly deserves a mention. That comes in 8th in the world. I'm sure Mauritius Telecom are very, very proud of that. So, and that's recognised in this slide here. So I'm here to talk about Europe, so let me just focus a little bit more on Europe. And again, looking at it's exactly the same scale, so the percentage across the top of number of premises which are connected in each country. And you can see, by and large, that the smaller countries are at the top. So Latvia, Sweden, Lithuania, now Russia's in there, as I mentioned, but then it goes down to Belarus and Iceland. So where are the big countries? So I want to just draw out some detail in here. And the first on there of the larger countries is Spain. So Spain's been a huge success story as far as fibre to the home is concerned. Telefonica really started the deployment, and then that was followed up by what became Vodafone and Orange after various takeovers. And really, it's competition that's driven that. So you get buildings which are actually fed by 3 different operators, which is great for vendors like Corning, because they sell lots more products. And so competition is a very good thing, which has driven deployment. And as you can see, that's all fibre to the home. So a really good story for our business. Then we look at France, and France is a really interesting country. France is right in the middle of its build. Now, a lot of that is fibre to the building, because that was driven by the large, dense cities, where obviously they're dominated by MDUs. But now France is really moving out into the more rural areas, and now the proportion of fibre to the home is certainly increasing. Now, there are some other countries to draw out here. Italy and Germany, for example, very big countries in terms of the number of premises, and you can see right at the bottom, and as someone who comes from the UK and lives in the UK, I'm sad to say that the UK doesn't even make the list. So I take this as a story of, there's a lot of opportunity for our business in terms of supply of components in Europe, because the main countries have not really deployed heavily. Now we look at just a split of the total number of subscribers and the total number of homes passed, and that comes out at 52 million in Europe and Russia, or CIS, and 148 million homes passed. And just the split there, it's split into the EU 28. So the EU 28 is the European Union in effect. CIS is Russia and those eastern states. And you can see that, for example, the homes passed, of the total homes passed, 35% are in Russia and CIS, 49% are in EU 28, and you may well ask, why does that not add up to 100%? And that's because there are some countries which don't fit into each category, like Norway, Turkey, Switzerland, etc. But the key headline numbers there are 148 million homes passed, 52 million homes connected. So now let's look a little bit at the increases or the changes year by year. And what we see here are both the EU 28 in orange and CIS in orange and EU 28 in darker red, and then the totals in blue. And the graph on the right is showing the homes passed. And you can see there was a step really in 2013 to 14, and then certainly the CIS has kind of plateaued out now. So this is the total number of homes passed cumulative. So if this is horizontal, then there's not much new build happening. But we see a reasonable kind of increase in EU 28. But what we do see is a difference in terms of the subscribers. So these are homes connected. And even though the homes passed has plateaued, the homes connected continues to increase. So what we're seeing here is that the investment's been made in fibre to the home deployments, but the connections are increasing year by year. So a positive trend for sure. Now, a very interesting trend is really about who's actually building. So this analysis is based on, it's a bottom-up analysis, so these are based on actual projects which have been identified as part of the analysis. And there are 400 total projects which have been analysed. And they've been split into incumbents, alternative operators and municipalities. And between 2011 and 2017, there's been a very big swing, and that's that the incumbents have gone from about 1/5 to 42% of the build is with incumbents. And again, that's a positive story. That's a lot driven by the fact that the incumbents are responding to competition from the alternative operators. And the good thing about incumbents is when they choose to build big. So that's again another positive indicator. Now we dig down a little bit more into the detail, and what we have here is these are homes passed totals year by year in each country. So you can see here we have Russia, and that's 2014, 15, 16 and 17. And obviously Russia dominates, as I mentioned, because of the amount of fibre to the building. But what's interesting here is the slope. So you can see Russia's tailing off, Spain is flattening out, but you see some other countries, like here UK is in, and it's starting to increase a significant ramp, so 31% increase in just 1 year. And we go to the the homes connected take up, and here you see some real action. So as I say, UK from a very low level is increasing last year by 67%. Places like Poland and Italy, again from a low level, they're really starting to take off. But also you can see that Spain, which was very flat in terms of homes passed, is ramping up in homes connected. So again, it's the same trend. Where fibre to the home networks exist, they are being connected to, and for every connection, that represents revenue. So a positive story. Also, what's been analysed is the take rate. So what these percentages represent are the percentage of connections as a percentage of the number of homes passed. So often a fibre to the home business case will be based on 25 or 30% homes connected to give a return on investment. And we can see here we're getting much higher figures in a lot of these Northeast Europe countries, Finland 44%, Latvia 47%. So again, that represents when fibre is there, it is used. And the average overall for EU 39, so that includes CIS, is 35% take rate. EU 28, 32% take rate. So business case supporting take rates are being achieved. So the conclusions from the market panorama. So yes, it's been another year of strong growth, and I think one of the most important things is that the indicators are for increased growth, and that comes from the reluctant countries. So by reluctant countries, these are by and large the larger countries who've invested often in VDSL networks, who are now migrating very much to fibre to the home networks. But there's still more to go. That average overall for Europe was 32% take rate, and there's still work to do in terms of improving the attractiveness of fibre to the home. And that's likely to happen as bandwidth demands increase. So governments and local authorities are having an increasing influence. So there's a lot of regulatory work going on in Europe. We have the Digital Agenda Europe objectives, which is, in a nutshell, that 100% of all premises should have a minimum 100 meg by 2025. So 100 meg may sound not a lot. It doesn't necessarily need fibre to the home. But you remember that those premises, we're talking about 100% of all premises, a proportion of those will be low density rural areas where it's actually more difficult to serve with copper. So as we go more and more deeper into the build, it's more likely, maybe not what you'd expect, but it's more likely that those builds will be fibre. Now it's worth calling out Open Fibre in Italy. So Open Fibre is a government-funded initiative with the NL, which is the power utility in Italy. And they're really the most dynamic builder in Italy, and that's why Italy is now entering the league table. And just a month or so ago, it was announced that there was a 3.5 billion euro funding was announced to increase Open Fibre's build. And so that's the biggest ever announcement for funding for a fibre to the home build. And again, significantly, that is partly government money, European government money, Italian government money, but also a large proportion is from the banks. So the financial institutions are increasingly seeing fibre to the home as a worthwhile investment. The highest take rates are very much in the northern and eastern countries. And I just want to mention 5G quickly. So 5G is having a more important role. So there's a lot talked about 5G, and there's a lot of unknowns about 5G. But there are two knowns which are important. Certainly, first one is that there's going to be a huge proliferation of devices to support the 5G deployment. And secondly, those devices will need fibre to feed them. So the two technologies are very much complementary. So fibre to the home supports 5G, 5G supports fibre to the home. So as that evolves over the coming years, that's going to have a positive influence on the overall situation for fibre to the home in Europe. Okay, so that's the first part of the presentation. The next part is the socio-economic benefits of fibre. So this was a study where we looked at the residential users of fibre to the home and what they think of their service. So that study was done by a consultancy called Wick Consult. It was presented at the Fibre to the Home conference in Valencia in February this year. And it was based on a consumer survey in Sweden of people who actually use broadband and try to correlate what they think of their service with how that service is delivered. It was just over 1,000 consumers. It was done through a computer-aided web interview, and the questions were on the service providers, what level of satisfaction people had with their service, etc. So, I mean, there's an aspect that shows that it's quite a difficult survey to do because a lot of users don't really care how their service is delivered. They don't even know the difference between fibre to the home and other delivery mechanisms. But it did come out with some very interesting results. So in this slide here, we show the four main delivery mechanisms. So we show DSL, we show hybrid fibre coax or cable modems, we show fibre to the home, and we show wireless. And on this graph, green is good, blue is bad. So green is, I like it very much, and dark blue is, I don't like it at all. And you can see there's a really, really significant trend here that shows that fibre to the home wins easily. So, you know, you can play around with the figures and your definitions and say that 82% of fibre to the home customers say they like their service. So I see that as a huge win for fibre to the home. So fibre to the home is best, and you know, DSL is worst, as you'd expect, and cable and wireless comes somewhere in between. So we see that as a very positive indicator of how much people like fibre to the home. So we went into some more detail and tried to sort of dig down into the data. So we found that 74% of people who switch to fibre, remember often people don't know they're switching, it's not sold as fibre, it's shown as a higher bandwidth service. 74% said they noticed a difference. So, and obviously the reasons for that is because of the higher bandwidth, but also the range of services and value for money. So there's a range of different reasons for people to move to fibre to the home, but mostly it's driven by, you know, the higher bandwidth that fibre to the home can deliver. Also, we looked at what users, what drove their decision making. So 13% of users claim that they've consciously decided against fibre to the home. So Remember, this isn't kind of driven by the technology. That could be driven by the services, clearly the price, you know, the different services which can be offered. But also, one thing that came out very strongly here is that people who can't have fibre to the home generally want it. So 94% of non-fibre to the home users say that they would take it if it would become available. So that's a big message to operators, you know, with homes that aren't deployed. Generally, there is a demand for the service. And then maybe another counterintuitive thing that came from this study is looking at the proportion of fibre uses in different areas of the country. So it's broken down into urban, suburban, semi-rural and rural. So the further you go to the right, the lower density. And you can see that the lower density are actually a higher proportion of users, which is maybe what you wouldn't expect, but again, as fibre to the home deployments drive much more out into the rural areas, there is a bigger take-up because there's fewer alternative services which can provide that higher bandwidth. Okay, so that was the socio-economic study, and the final part of this presentation is looking at the policy and regulation aspect. So there is a lot happening in policy and regulation, and it is for sure having an increasing impact on the market in terms of operators' decisions to build. So there really is a political commitment to gigabit society targets, and it's a fibre-based infrastructure that is very much enabling those commitments to be met. There's new terminology which has come into general use and into the legal vocabulary, which is very high capacity connectivity, and that's a regulatory objective. So regulatory objectives were much more around kind of promoting competition and inclusion and looking after the interests of citizens generally. But this requirement for very high capacity as a differentiator has come into the regulatory environment more and more. So recently there's been a new directive issued, the European Electronic Communication Code, which is, I wouldn't profess to know the detail of this because it's hundreds of pages of legal documentation. But really that is the governing factors which have come from the European Parliament recently in the last few months to actually to control the market. And this very high capacity network is built into that regulation, and there are speed and latency requirements built into that. And while I'm not going to say that means it has to be fibre, it does point very, very strongly to favouring fibre, let's say. So it's kind of becoming more and more fibre focused, the regulation. There's much more prioritisation of competitive infrastructure. So a lot of what's happening in where there's been high levels of fibre to the home deployment, it's been driven by competition. And of course now there's much more regulatory certainty. So regulatory uncertainty has been put forward previously as a barrier to fibre to the home deployment. So people are not willing to invest their money if the rules may change in the future, but now that's becoming much more clear. And there's much more deployment of wholesale only networks. So these are open access networks like OpenServe. So the word open is now becoming more and more prevalent in terms of the names of operators. So OpenReach in the UK, there's Open Fibre in Italy, but there are also fibre-only operators like Zero in Ireland, for example, who are now sort of driving the fibre-only or fibre to the home deployment, and that's very much supported by the regulation. So the concluding remarks on regulation is that ubiquitous fibre, future-proof fibre infrastructure, which is very much a fibre to the home deployment. That's enabling a wide range of new technologies, and the investment is really becoming available. it's seen as a much more realistic investment, and we had some discussions earlier on exactly that topic. The political targets and the commitment are kind of key prerequisites. So, you know, the regulation is definitely having an effect on increasing fibre deployment. And the end user demand is increasing for sure. And so, you know, we're expecting the further future benefits of fibre to come through. So finally, let me just remind you about the Fibre to the Home Conference Europe. You know, that's who I'm representing here today. And the conference is going to be in, next year in 2009 with two significant changes to the conference. Firstly is when the conference is, and secondly is where it is. So in terms of when, it's in March. So every conference previously has been in February. So there's less of a clash, for example, or it's less close to the Mobile World Congress. And secondly, it's in Amsterdam. So, you know, previously it's been in Luxembourg, Valencia, Marseille. And Amsterdam is one of the centres of Europe as far as communications and travel is concerned. So I'm pretty sure most African countries, for example, will have direct links to Amsterdam. So we're expecting a much bigger turnout in Amsterdam. It's going to be we've got high expectations for the show, and we're sure it's going to be a great success. So anyone who's thinking of attending, then obviously you're very welcome, and we'd love to see you there. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope that was useful, and of course, any questions?
Thanks, Mike. Very, very interesting to see what's happening in Europe. Just a question from my side. My ancestral homeland there seems to be lagging a lot behind. What's happening in Germany? Why are they? Is Angela Merkel not stimulating the market, or is Brexit scaring you guys? What's happening there?
Well, I'm not sure of Angela Merkel's direct intervention in this, but I mean, there are a number of drivers behind fibre to the home deployment, and why a country or an operator decides to build things like competition, the cost, regulation, and particularly the ability of the current copper network. So, particularly in places like Germany, they do have a very capable copper network. And that copper network can support, good speeds in terms of VDSL and, vectoring and GDOT-fast. So all these kind of copper technologies have been deployed, and that investment has been made. So in other countries, in sort of Eastern Europe and some kind of Mediterranean countries, the quality of the copper network isn't so good, so it can't support higher bandwidth. So that's supported fibre to the home, but you can only do so much, and so that position is changing for sure. And of course, the point I mentioned earlier, the further you get from the central office, the more difficult it becomes for copper, and so fibre deployment becomes the medium of choice.
Ja, das ist gut, ja?
Yeah.
Any questions for Mike and the European experience? There's a gentleman there. Can't see you, just.
Hi, it's Greg. I saw you had statistics on uptake around fibre. Do you have overlaying statistics on the uptake of other broadband technologies so that we can get a feel, is it hitting the 44% uptake because that's the only people who want broadband in the area? Or, is 90% of the market already consuming a broadband service? It's only 10% not buying, and the other, 40-odd% are using competing technologies.
Well, I think it's a similar story, really, in terms of one of the good things about Europe is its diversity, and the situation varies so widely from country to country. So Latvia is at the top of the table. UK is towards the bottom of the table, and they're very, very different countries with different, different telecom networks, different regimes, different in terms of regulation and markets. So, no, I mean the study, the IDH study, just looks at the take-up of fibre to the home deployments. There's no study that certainly that I know of that compares, take-up of, competing technologies in, for each individual country. So, I know that fibre to the home, the deployments are, or the take-up rates are increasing, steadily. We saw that on one of the graphs. So I don't know about specific countries. I'm sorry.
Any other questions? All right, then we'll wrap this one up. Mike, thank you very much for attending and for your contribution. It's been very valuable, very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.